For over 17 years, the search for Madeleine McCann has remained unanswered. But what few people know is that 3 fatal mistakes in the investigation compromised everything from the start. Mistakes that not only delayed the search, but may have ensured that this mystery would never be solved. Today, we will uncover what went so wrong and why these errors were never corrected. If you, like me, can't stop thinking about the unresolved details of this case and want to understand deeply what happened, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Here, every mystery is a step towards the truth. From the beginning, the crime scene was handled disastrously. When the first police officers arrived at the McCann apartment, something essential was overlooked. The location for evidence collection, the scene was accessed by tourists, hotel staff, family friends, and even Madeleine's own parents. This oversight created an almost irreversible situation. Footprints, fingerprints, and any other traces that could point to what happened that night were erased. An investigator who revisited the case years later said, "It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing." Now imagine what could have been found there if the area had been properly isolated. Some fiber, a DNA trail, or even an object left behind by the perpetrator. But all of this was lost before it could be analyzed. What bothers me most is that even with this obvious failure, no one was held accountable. It's as if that critical moment was forgotten while the world tried to move on without the answers it could have provided. When I think about the night Madeleine disappeared, I imagine how every minute must have felt like an eternity for the McCanns. But while the desperate search for answers began, something essential was ignored: the care for the crime scene. The apartment where Madeleine was last seen should have been transformed into an inviolable space where every detail would be analyzed. But what happened was the opposite. Instead of protecting the location, allowing investigators to gather clues accurately, the area became almost a meeting point. Curious tourists came and went. Hotel staff passed by the apartment. Even family friends were there, trying to help, but without realizing that their actions were erasing possible traces of what really happened. The police themselves were slow to realize the importance of isolating the environment. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. With every movement, something important disappeared. I can't help but think about what could have been found if the apartment had been properly preserved. Maybe footprints in the external area, or fingerprints near the bed where Madeleine slept. Maybe a hair strand or a fiber left by someone who shouldn't have been there. And the most distressing thing is that the first moments after a crime are crucial. Experts call this the golden window. It's the period when clues are still fresh before time or human actions erase them. In Madeleine's case, this window closed before it could even be used. I remember a similar case from the 80s where the lack of care for the crime scene almost guaranteed that the culprit would never be found. A boy disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and investigators neglected to preserve the location where he was last seen. It wasn't until years later, when they reopened the case, that they discovered a crucial footprint had been erased by a police boot. The truth was there, but was destroyed by haste and lack of organization. In Madeleine's case, the story is not much different. To this day, when I revisit the initial failures, I keep thinking about the questions that will never be answered. For example, there were reports of people who said they saw someone lurking around the area before the disappearance. Could any of these people have left a mark in the apartment, a fingerprint, a footprint? And if they did, was it erased in that confusion? Another point that always bothers me is the lack of clarity about what was actually found there. The information is contradictory. Some sources say that objects were collected but never analyzed. Others claim there was nothing significant. The truth is that with such a compromised crime scene, we will never know what was truly present that night. And this raises a bigger question. Why didn't those involved realize the gravity of the situation? Was it due to lack of training, disorganization, or simply because no one wanted to believe that something so terrible had happened there? I keep thinking about how cruel time is in these cases, because while the crime scene was handled carelessly, Madeleine's trail grew colder. Every erased footprint, every contaminated fingerprint represented a lost opportunity to find the truth. Now imagine how different it would have been if that apartment had been isolated immediately. If the police had entered and, before any movement, turned the location into an untouched space, analyzing every corner. Maybe today we would be telling a different story, a story with answers. Looking at all this, what bothers me most is that such errors are not rare. Cases like Madeleine's reflect how haste and lack of protocol can turn tragedies detectives into unsolvable mysteries. And thinking about this, a doubt keeps lingering in my mind. Were the failures that night just the result of confusion and disorganization, or was something else going on behind the scenes? Something that prevented the truth from being found even before it was sought? What intrigues me is not only what was lost at that crime scene, but what it caused throughout the rest of the investigation. Everything that follows is also in doubt. And in Madeleine's case, this led to another mistake that completely changed the course of the case, and which may have been even more devastating. Shortly after Madeleine's disappearance, the Portuguese police directed much of their efforts toward a specific theory that the parents were involved in the crime. To do this, important clues that could point to other suspects were completely ignored. For example, there were reports of people who said they saw a man carrying something resembling a child near the resort that night. These witnesses could have provided crucial information, but their testimonies were not thoroughly investigated. Instead, efforts were focused on finding flaws in the McCann's statements. This obsession with a single line of investigation delayed the search for Madeleine and created a chasm of distrust between the family and the police. Official documents show that while the police worked to prove the McCann's guilt, other evidence was simply sidelined. And this raises a question that won't leave my mind. If all lines of investigation had been treated with the same seriousness, could Madeleine have been found? When the Portuguese police decided to concentrate their efforts on Kate and Jerry McCann, the course of the investigation changed drastically, and not for the better. By placing the parents at the center of suspicions, other possibilities were left unexplored. It's impossible not to wonder how many clues were buried while the police tried to prove the McCanns were guilty. Reports indicate that at the time, witnesses reported suspicious movements around the resort. Some people spoke of a man carrying something that seemed to be a child. Others noticed unknown vehicles in the area days before the disappearance. But instead of following these leads immediately, efforts turned almost exclusively to finding inconsistencies in the McCann statements. I keep thinking, what if the time spent trying to prove a single theory had been used to broaden the search? Maybe in that interval, Madeleine's trail could have been found, or at least a new line of investigation could have emerged. This focus on the parents also had a devastating effect outside the investigation. Public opinion was divided. While some people believed in the McCann's innocence, others began to see them as suspects, judging every gesture or statement. And this created a smokescreen that diverted attention from what really mattered, finding Madeleine. But this mistake was not isolated. It is part of a pattern seen in other famous cases. In 1996, in the United States, a similar crime drew attention. A child disappeared, and the local police immediately focused on the parents as the main suspects. For months, investigators ignored reports from neighbors and external clues. Years later, it was discovered that the culprit was a stranger, someone who had no connection to the family, but could have been identified much earlier. These stories show how dangerous it is to create a single scenario for a crime without considering all possibilities. In Madeleine's case, this decision not only delayed the investigation, but also created wounds that will probably never heal. Now, what worries me most is how these initial failures connect to the next point. Because if the exclusive focus on the McCanns had already compromised the investigation, what came next was even more devastating: the lack of cooperation between police forces. What bothers me most is not just the time lost on a single theory, but what followed. Because when an investigation that is already compromised faces a lack of unity among authorities, the chances of success practically disappear. In Madeleine's case, this led to a third mistake that sealed the case's fate, and perhaps the answers we still seek. Madeleine's disappearance was not just a local case. It quickly became an international mystery, with teams from Portugal and the United Kingdom trying to work together. But what should have been a joint force turned into an ego clash. The Portuguese police and British authorities did not share information efficiently. Each side seemed more concerned with protecting its reputation than with solving the case. Experts say that in investigations like this, real-time information exchange is crucial to finding answers. But in this case, it almost didn't exist. Official reports show that clues arising in the United Kingdom took weeks to reach the hands of the Portuguese police, and vice versa. Meanwhile, Madeleine's trail grew colder and colder, and this leads us to a troubling question. How many answers were lost because of this lack of cooperation? If authorities had worked together from the start, would we be telling of the lack of cooperation between the Portuguese police and British authorities? It becomes clear that this was more than just a simple mistake. It was a fatal blow to the chances of finding Madeleine. Every piece of information that was delayed in being shared, every misunderstanding or conflict between the teams, represented a lost opportunity. Madeleine's disappearance quickly became an international interest case, but the police forces were not prepared to handle the complexity of this situation. Instead of working together, the authorities of Portugal and the United Kingdom seemed to be competing, as if prestige was more important than than the life of a missing child. For example, when British authorities suggested using modern DNA analysis techniques, the Portuguese police hesitated, arguing that this could compromise the investigation. This delay cost precious weeks, while the DNA collected in the McCann's apartment and on Madeleine's clothes remained unanalyzed. And there's more. Reports show that some clues raised by the United Kingdom, such as suspicious sightings on the night of the disappearance, took days, sometimes weeks, to reach the hands of the Portuguese police. In cases like this, time is the greatest enemy, and these communication failures only worsen the situation. But what disturbs me most is that these errors were not inevitable. There were precedents. In other international cases, we've seen how efficient cooperation can make a difference. In 2007, for example, a girl disappeared in Germany, and thanks to the immediate collaboration between local and international authorities, she was found within days. Why didn't this happen in Madeleine's case? Looking back, it's impossible not to feel frustration, because every delay, every argument between the teams pushed the answers further away. And meanwhile, Madeleine remained missing. But there's something that hasn't been said yet, a detail that at first glance may seem insignificant, but could completely change how we view this case. What intrigues me most about the lack of cooperation is not just the delays or misunderstandings, it's what was hidden behind it. There is a connection, a detail buried in the midst of this confusion that could be the key to understanding not only the mistakes, but what really happened that night. When we analyze the numbers related to missing children cases, the reality is harsh and often frightening. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, about 800,000 children disappear every year around the world. Of these cases, a significant portion never gets resolved. Statistics indicate that in over 70% of cases, the first 48 hours are crucial for resolution. And it is precisely here that Madeleine McCann's case becomes even more frustrating. These first hours, known as the golden window in investigations, were marked by failures that could have been avoided. The lack of isolation of the crime scene, the exclusive focus on the parents, and the conflicts between international authorities not only compromised the initial progress, but also severely limited the chances of finding Madeleine. Now let's look at a statistic that deeply affected me. According to a study published in 2018, only 15% of missing children cases where there are failures in the initial investigation get resolved. This means that human error, especially in the early stages, is one of the biggest factors ensuring that a case remains unsolved. In Madeleine's case, these mistakes became evident very early on. For example, when the crime scene was contaminated, investigators lost the opportunity to find traces that could connect the crime to a suspect. And this is not just a hypothesis. In 2013, a forensic report revealed that some DNA samples collected in the apartment could have been more useful if they had been analyzed quickly and with the technologies available at the time. But the impact doesn't end there. The lack of cooperation between Portuguese and British authorities was also devastating. In international cases, like the disappearance of Natasha Kampusch in Austria, we've seen that efficient collaboration can change the game. Natasha was found after 8 years, thanks to the joint work of local and international investigators. In Madeleine's case, this union never happened. And then a question arises that won't leave my mind. What would have happened if the investigation had been handled more carefully from the start? Would we be talking about a solved case today? To understand better, it's important to look at patterns in similar cases. Studies show that in 85% of disappearances, the kidnapper is someone who knew the victim's routine. This statistic raises an intriguing point. Who could know the resort's layout and the family's movements well enough to act? Comes from an Interpol report, which states that in kidnapping cases, the victim's trail usually disappears after the first 10 kilometers. This means that if Madeleine was taken far away, the initial searches would have needed to be quickly expanded, something that didn't happen due to logistical failures in the investigation. But here's something I can't get out of my head: the negligence with external clues. In 2007, witnesses reported sightings of a man carrying something that seemed to be a child near the resort. This information was only taken seriously years later when a television program re-examined the case and showed recreated images. Why weren't these clues urgently explored at the time? If we look at other missing children cases, it's clear that the chances of resolution increase dramatically when investigation teams are quick and efficient. The J.C. Dugard case, for example, took 18 years to be solved, but was only resolved because the clues were never ignored. Even when everything seemed to be against the investigators, the persistence in connecting small details led to the truth. And there lies the difference. In Madeleine's case, the mistakes created a cascade effect that made it difficult, if not impossible, to piece together what really happened that night. The lingering question is, were these errors just a result of disorganization, or was there something else going on behind the scenes? When I look at the numbers and stories like Madeleine's, I feel a mix of indignation and hope. Indignation because, in a case that had so much potential to be solved, human errors prevailed, but also hope because there are still clues that can be reviewed, technologies that can be applied, and perhaps even answers waiting to be found. And that's exactly what keeps me engaged, because as long as there is a possibility, however small, of bringing justice to Madeleine, this case deserves our attention. After all, what happened that night can still be uncovered. But is time on our side? Looking at all this data, one thing becomes clear. The Madeleine McCann case is not just a mystery. It is a reflection of how mistakes, omissions, and disputes can bury the truth. But what if there is still something that went unnoticed? These three mistakes, failing to isolate the scene, exclusively focusing on the parents, and the lack of international cooperation, created a domino effect that compromised the search for Madeleine McCann from the start. And the hardest thing to accept is that all these mistakes could have been avoided. Now, after so many years, the question remains, is it too late to correct these errors? Or is there a chance that the truth can still be found? If you watch this far, comment, "Operation, I am part of the search for the truth," so I know you followed the video to the end. And tell me, which of these mistakes do you think had the greatest impact on the case? I want to hear your opinion. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because in the next video we will talk about another intriguing case where small forgotten details may hold the answers the world is waiting for. Don't miss it. Until next time, and remember, the mystery never disappears. It just waits to be solved.